Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Connectors Live. Let me just get my screen right there. Uh, Welcome. I'm excited to have you back. Today, we're going to have a really exciting episode. We're going to talk about OpenAI, and we're going to be dealing with their platform APIs to look at how we could start to integrate with models, chat completions, and then starting to look at how we can expose our assistants through the beta assistance API. I have a pretty full agenda for us today. There's a lot for us to get through. So why don't I share my screen and let's just jump straight into it. Okay, so what I have on the screen right now is the OpenAI's documentation. This is for their APIs. Where we're going to start out today is we're going to be actually looking at the platform APIs and specifically the models. There's a lot of different models. There's always new models being released out. So first, we're just going to look at how can we expose listing out some of our models and things that we might be able to use to then go and look at how we can take that into the chat completions, which if I scroll up or down, I see, oh, there it is, chat completion. And inside chat completions, this is where we can actually provide specific models inside of there. So let's actually walk through those first two steps. So first, we're going to look at the models. Let's go back to the platform API models. So we just want to start out by listing all the models we have. Now I'm going to switch over to VS Code where I have a little project set up with the connectors community. And we're going to look at, what would it look like to create a model? And then we're going to want to look at what it would look like to create a root query that allows us to get our models. And that would be an array of model. So we're really just going to expose those first two things out. Now, I've already defined the @source. If you haven't seen a Connectors Live episode before, we always start out by setting up the source. So we have the base URL for the API, which is of OpenAI. And then I'm going to be passing along our authorization token in this example. Now, let's go look at the documentation again. And so we have this get URL with models, and then what the response object here is. So what I always like to do first is let's take this response and let's go into our connectors mapping playground. Let's paste that in here. And let's look at just starting to make what that list of models would be. So it looks like we want to expand out our data object. And then inside of that, I have an error in line 30, line 14, position 39. Trailing comma. Oh, is this actually it? Huh, I do not see that trailing comma error in our thing. So that might be something in a copy paste that I just cannot see on the screen right now. Okay, well, we would be pulling out our ID owned by and created. We probably would have like created that we're going to pull through there. I definitely just don't see where my trailing comma is inside of here. So I'm just going to push past this. Oh, no. Is this a trailing comma too? Ah, there it is. I found it. Woo. That's how it goes. Sometimes the documentation has some little copy pasta errors. But now we can see that data coming through. So we're expanding out that data. We're taking the ID, the owned by, and the created. Sometimes I like to, make this more like created at, just to be a little more verbose. And so now we can go ahead and we can take this information. Let's keep it as created just for simplicity's sake today. And I'm going to copy that and go back over into VS Code. And now we basically just need to build those things. So we had our ID, we had created, which was actually an integer in that. Could put a float. I probably should put a float, but I think it's epoch time. And then owned by. And then now we can put in our @connect directive and define all of our information. So our source, we called it OpenAI. And then in our URL, this is actually the /models. And then in the selection, I can just paste all of this in there. And that's it. Now we have essentially our models exposed. It's going to our models endpoint. And then we have a little selection created, owned by, and everything there. So now we can start up Rover Dev. So I'm going to run my Rover Dev task in the background to get that started up. Then now we can come back over to our Apollo routers instance. Refresh this page. Okay, so now we have our query. We can see our models right here, owned by, created by. We can run that query and we get all of this information. And the reason I started out with the models here is because there's actually so many different models that are offered by OpenAI. And sometimes just getting the ID that you need to interact with those models isn't as easy as you'd think. It's easy for the simple ones like GPT-4o, but when you want to start getting into some of the preview models or maybe what some other things are, like there's this 4.1 nano now, this is a nice way we can expose that. And if we want, just real quickly, since we're here, we can also just retrieve individual models. So sometimes just because we have that, I like to bring that back in and just, expose essentially a simple model, right? And we can do that with just model. We have an ID that we're going to need to provide. It's going to have a single model. I can really just copy this entire connect inside of here. And then we're just going to need to add in that argument. So it's going to be args.id. Now, the difference here is pretty much the same. If we save this, sometimes I like to just copy it, head back over. Now that we've kind of created this model, let's just see GPT-410 nano, since I was selecting that one. So if I create a new tab, we should see model here now. I'll just add the fields in and put that new ID, run it. And sometimes you'll see this where I didn't get that information. This is where we can jump into that connectors debugger, see what our mapping error, data is not found. Oh, it's because it's not in a data object right now. So the pattern of how OpenAI has their platform API is the data field is when there's ever going to be an array of objects. So we can just go back into that connector we had and just remove that data spread. Okay, save the file, everything hot reloads. Then we can come back here, press the play button. We don't see any warnings or errors, and we got that information. So awesome. So now we've basically walked through just exposing, what are the models that we even have available to us coming from OpenAI. Now, that's cool that we have these models and everything, but really what we want to start doing is we want to start exposing these models. We want to start bringing these models into a new world that, people outside of these platform APIs can start using them. And that's kind of where we start building into our application. Now, what we want to do next is we start talking about the chat completions. So if we come back up here, the chat completion, we really want to be able to create a chat completion. This is where we can give like a message. This is what we're doing. And then the model, there's things around like storing it and stuff like that. We don't really need to do anything in that world, but there's a lot of information that we can provide in here. We're really just going to focus on how can we create a chat completion that has a simple message that we're sending along, and we should be able to kind of change the model that's inside of there. So let's first start out by just creating the schema that we want that's going to let us, create this chat completion at this post URL. So let's go back to VS Code. And this is where we're going to introduce a mutation. Now, I'm just doing a mutation because we're creating a chat completion. There's no reason why this couldn't be inside of a query, as if it was like, some additional data that you're trying to add on to a field in a type in your graph or something like that. But for our example today, I'm just going to make a completion right here. Now, I do want to be able to change the model, but I probably should make it default to something. So I know there's the GPT-4o mini. That is a very popular model right now. And then one of the things about the chat completions is we can actually provide an array of messages. And I think this is really important because sometimes you might want to enable an individual message coming from a user of the API. And then you might want to actually create multiple messages behind the scenes, or you might want to let your user provide messages. You might even want to have a point where you inject a message in front of that. Those are all things you can do with connectors with inside of our JSON selection. So we're going to want to create an input that's going to have a set of messages with it that's required. And then we're going to have some chat completion object that's going to come out of that. So a couple things that we need to do. First, we need to have that input. So I noticed if we come back, when we start looking at the messages, you saw there's a role and a content. And so really, when we look at those messages, right, here's the possible types. You see there's a developer message, a system message, a user message, an assistant message, a tool message, function message. There's a bunch of different message types, right? And this is how, when we're building out our agents, our assistants, the AI experience we're trying to provide, this is where you may want to inject a system message into those messages. You may want to have a developer message or then a user message. There's various ways you might want to put these messages together, but that role is something that we're going to want that to be as part of our input that people can provide. So let's go back to VS Code and let's create this message input. So we have our message input. We have content, and then we have a role. And I'm just gonna put message role. And that message role is really an enumeration that we want. Because when someone's actually putting this message argument in, we want them to be able to select like which message role are they putting in. So you have things like system, assistant. I might spell some of these wrong. I should probably copy and paste this, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so those were the message types that we had in there. So we kind of have the role that's inside of there. And then we have this chat completion. And that's really the response that we want to get back. Sometimes, deciding like what you want this shape to be can be a challenge. Like, what should it look like, everything? I usually try and keep my models very closely to what the request body is. So I like to sometimes just kind of copy this, bring it into the connectors mapper, and then just start mapping out what I want that chat completion response, right? So like this ID seems pretty important, right? So I probably need the ID. We have created, right? So I'll do the created. We want that. It might be important to be able to see the model. I know you're sending the model with it, but we can just bring that along. And then we kind of have choices with this message. And then we have usage. I think usage is really important. This is kind of that information we typically see in our playground environments and everything. So I definitely want to bring along the usage information. So I'm going to do that one first. So we have usage. And I don't know if I'm going to want to take everything out of here, but I'm going to take, let's say, the prompt tokens. And then let's see, completion and total. Let's just do those. So I'll copy total tokens, completion tokens. Make these all camel case. Oh, prompt. Oh, how did I copy that? Oh, I didn't notice there. Total tokens. I was not paying attention to how I was copy pasting. Okay. Total tokens. There we go. That seems like a better spelling. Okay, and so now we want to get that usage, that message information now that we have our usage. And so the message information is all buried inside of these choices. Now, there's a lot of different ways we may want to handle this. We're bringing an array back. You may have a time where you want to just take like that first message. These are all things we can do in our JSON selection. So if I had wanted to do something like message, I could go, $ choices first and get that first message and start spreading it out. Since we're going to be doing an array of like messages, I'm not going to grab just the first one. We're just going to do it on all of the choices. And so we have our content, which that was just what the message.content in here. Choices. Content is message. Oh, too many S's. One message, or one S, or two S's in message. And then now that we have the content, we need to have the role. Now the roles where we had that enumeration, right? And we had like the system, the assistant, the user, the function, the tool, the developer. So we're going to need to match the values that's coming in that role. All right, so that's that lowercase. We're going to need that to come through looking like whatever the enumeration is. So we're going to match that. And I'm going to copy and paste this so I don't make an error here of the enumeration spelling. But now you can see that that lowercase assistant is actually being matched to an uppercase inside of here. And that's really it. We kind of just put together our mapping of what we need in that type. So I'm going to copy that. If we come back to VS Code, we still haven't defined our chat completion, which is okay. But this is a good opportunity for us to put together that connect directive inside of here. And so I'm just going to post that selection in since I already have it kind of copied. Let's minimize this to make a little more space. And now what we really need to do is we need to change kind of the source and the HTTP information. So we have our OpenAI source. We are going to have this be, let's go back to the docs and double check this stuff. So we have a post to chat completions inside of here. Looks like we need to have messages, model, and we don't have to have store, but messages is definitely a required one and models required. Store is if you want to store the messages and things like that in OpenAI. Definitely something that works well. It's a nice little option to not have to store them yourselves. But we're going to need to put the messages, the model to that post endpoint. So we'll change this to be a post. Then we'll change this to be chat completions. And then we're going to need to create a body that's associated with it. We said there was what? The model and then the messages that we need to create, right? So we have our model right here. So we can just go args.model, no problem. And then now the messages. And remember, this is this message input. So we're going to want to kind of structure that in the same way of what we needed. So we can spread open those messages. The content is just content because we have that on our input type. Now, the next thing we need to do is remember, since the message input, if I show down here, we have that role as an enumeration. We're going to now have to map those uppercase values back to the lowercase values that are associated in that. And so similarly, like what we had before with our role, we'll have role match, oops. This is where we're basically going to have the inverse of what this role matching is. So I'm going to copy and paste it so we don't have spelling errors. So you can see we're really just mapping them back and forth inside of that. Now this one, it's really just uppercase to lowercase. A lot of times there's variations inside of here. But the nice thing about this is it lets the client developers select these, and we'll see it as we build out this operation. Now, we still hadn't built that chat completions yet. And now we can kind of start building that chat completions based on this selection that we had in here. So this is where I like to then start say, okay, I have my chat completion. So I have my ID that's inside of here. Then I have created, which was that float. Then model, which is a string. We have usage, and this is our token usage. So we'll want to create a token usage type. And it has 3 fields that are just numbers. So that's a pretty easy one. We have prompt tokens, and I like to use my little handy shortcuts in VS Code. I love doing that. Just makes it a little simpler to type those out. So we got our token usage in. And then the last thing we need to have is these messages, right? And so we have messages, and that's a set of chat messages. So we just need to create the messages, which has is that content and that role, right? So we have type chat message. We have our content, which is that string. And then we have that role, which is that message role. Now, when I save the file, we can see that, through that whole time, we had build errors, things that were going on, but we just made our fully complete connector now for the chat completions. All right, so we defined out our chat completion mutation, the model, that information, added in those messages. So let's hop back over to our playground and see what that looks like. So we'll open a new tab, go to the query. Oh, I put it on the mutation. Just kidding, right there on the mutation. Now, this is what I was meaning of what the client developer has. So I have my little variables that are down here. As I create them, I can get the role here. And this is where I should get property messages is not allowed. Oh, what did I do here? Oh, it's just because I don't have a thing selected. Okay. But now as a client developer that's building the interactions with these messages, you can see that now I can actually start creating, what those messages are. And I get that type completion in my client code where I can say, exactly what I want this to be. So for our example, this is just going to be from a user. Let's just say like, tell me a story in here. Now I will want to take the things like the model. Let's get that usage information and the message, role, and content. Now it takes a little bit of time because, it's ChatGPT, it's a model. I find, when you just do a chat completion like this, it's anywhere between 5 to 20 seconds, depending on what you're doing, depending on the model inside of there. But there we go. We see our chat completion. We see our token information. And you can see here's the story that it made for us, which is pretty sweet. And, this is really simple that we're just like invoking a model and everything. But what we've really done is we've connected an individual field on our graph to an LLM that's offered through OpenAI's API, right? And so there's a lot of things we can do in this. There's various ways where we might want to add some AI feature onto an existing type in our graph. You can actually just connect that in and use some of the arguments of like what we were doing. We're putting messages inside of here, but there's definitely ways where that message can include information from other fields and things. Now, I think what's really hot right now, though, is much more around assistants. So, having an assistant playground, I created a basic little assistant. One of the things I often get asked about, or I see a lot of people do, is using AI to create some like social media starting point or things like there. So I put together a little assistant inside of this. And the API does have a assistance, right? There's assistance in here. There's a lot of stuff you can do. But one of the things that's inside of here is we have threads and then we have runs. So you can actually create a thread and a run all at the same time with create thread and run. And basically what this is, every time someone sends a message into one of these assistants, you can basically queue up those messages together and then put them all together in one run. So we're quickly going to just add in what would it look like just to create the thread and run it. And then we'll be able to expose how to get the messages from that run. So let's go back into VS Code and let's actually add in our create thread and run. So I'm going to put create thread and run. We're going to need the assistance ID of what we're going to put in there, and then just make it simple for now and just have a message that they're going to send. And that's going to return this run object. And if we come back to our documentation, this is that run object. And there's a couple things that are important here. I think like the ID of the run's important, the assistance is important. The thread is what's really important. And that's because these runs have a queued status. This is the processing where it might be doing other function calls, other things that are going on. So really what we need to do is we just need to pull out the thread information and the run information so we can then get the messages for that thread. So we're going to make this real simple in the starting point. We're basically just going to pull out the IDs for the run, the thread, and that assistant. So we'll go to VS Code, and we're going to create that run object. Has that ID, has a thread. Now, whenever I see like an ID, like thread ID in the response, I always make a habit just to spread it out like this. Typically, as it's a good hint that it might be an entity that you want to connect in the future. And client developers typically don't use like this ID except for just a future API call. So providing in this format, I think is definitely an okay thing to do. So we have the ID of the run, the thread, and the assistant that's coming through. In the interest of time for us, I'm going to put this @connect on here. I'm just going to paste in the selection so we don't have to recreate everything in there. This is still going to be the OpenAI source. We're going to have our post. This is going to be threads runs, I think. Let's double check that in the documentation. Yep, threads runs. Post to that with the assistant ID. And so we're going to need to put that assistant ID in the body of that request. And that's just going to be from our arguments. And then we have the thread that's being created. It's going to have a set of messages. Now, we're just simply putting the single message inside of there, and we're just going to say that's coming from a user. And what we can do with that is we can make this actually just a literal array, where now we can have our role just be user, and then we can have the content actually come from the args message inside of there. Now, the last thing for this is we need to put in our headers. OpenAI has a little requirement for the assistance API. We have to put a little header value in that has assistance equals v2 inside of that. Awesome. And so that actually is creating a thread and a run. So I just saved it, hot reloaded in the background. And if we go back to our little playground, we'll create a new world. So here's our create thread and run that's inside of here now. So I'm going to create the thread. Now we have what assistant. So if I go into my playground, that's this ID right here. So if you click it, just copies it. And then what message? Now, this is supposed to be about social media stuff. We're having a community event on 4/30/2025 in our community forums. It's going to cover other AI topics like MCP server, and we will want to get the threads ID for this. So I'm just going to click the play button, and we can see that ran. We have the thread ID. Just real quick, if we look in the debugger and look at the response, you can see this is where things come back queued. So when you're actually using the Assistant's Playground, you can stream the responses. If you actually uncheck the streaming responses, what I'm talking about is up here, you'll actually see they do this polling mechanism of what's going on in the background. And really what they end up doing is they want to get the messages for a specific thread. So now that we've made the thread, we actually need to see like, what did you give me back as the response? And so we need to list the messages from that thread. So the last thing we're going to need to do is we're just going to need to add that into our root query. And so I have that. And in the interest of time, I'm going to copy and paste that in, and we'll talk about what actually is inside of there. Now, I copied kind of a bigger thing. And the first thing is I've created our messages that has our thread, but I've also added some of the pagination information. The API does have pagination information. So messages before a certain ID, after a certain ID, and then a limit based on a specific amount of arguments inside of there. And what that ends up requiring is we just need to create like a connection inside of there. And so I have this messages connection, which I will paste right here. We have a message connection. It has the pagination with that page info. And then we need to have a message. And the message is pretty straightforward. It's got that content, that role, that created at information. So I just pasted that inside of here. I had an assistant. Yeah. Actually, let me just bring that assistant back into this. So each message has an assistant. So you may want to get that out. This is another one of those. Let's provide the ID for that assistant. Now that I've saved the file, I can only have one type named assistant. Oh, did I name assistant twice? I did. I had that from a get-go part. Okay, so now we have everything in here. We save the file, everything recomposed. If we come back to our little playground, this was the thread we want to get. So I'm going to copy that value. If we go back to the root, look at the messages for that thread, I'm just going to go straight into the items. Let's get like that content, the message role, and then run that. And there we go. Now we're getting back the messages. So you can see there's actually, here's the first message of what we put inside of that. And then now here's the message that was generated by the assistant. So here's the content that they think would be good for a social media post. So we covered a ton of information here. I know I kind of ran through stuff fast because I really wanted to get us to the assistance API portion. And just to recap what we did, what we've walked through is we've essentially walked through building out what are the models that are exposed inside of OpenAI, so we can get those. Then we looked at how we can create a chat completion, so sending some natural language to one of those LLM models and getting back a response in there. And then we looked at how could we actually, one of the assistants we've created in OpenAI, how could we create threads and runs for those assistants and then be able to capture those messages back later on. And I really put together a simple implementation of creating the messages, creating those items, but you can really start to um, massage this in how you're designing your schema to accomplish a lot of very interesting use case scenarios. So I hope you all enjoyed this. I really enjoyed building out this connector. I've been doing a lot of stuff in the AI space since I presented Graph Chat back last year at GraphQL Summit, and I have some exciting stuff that's going to be coming more following on these assistance worlds. So stay tuned for our next episode of Connectors Live next month, where we're going to start diving into some other assistant development, and we're going to have a little MCP server take over. And then we're also going to have a couple of community events coming up over the next couple of months. So check out our community forums, community.apollographql.com, where we're going to have our next community event just under a week from today, next Wednesday, in those forums. After this live stream, I'm going to post as a comment on both LinkedIn and YouTube the link to that community event where we're actually going to talk a little bit more about MCP server type of assistance. So I hope to see you there. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and happy coding. Thanks.